Okay, let's jump straight in. Here's everything that I read in June 2023. If you want to know what I've been up to, you can subscribe to my newsletter, support me on Patreon, and follow me on all of my socials, and all of those links are in the description. This list is just from lightest book to heaviest book. And as always, I read quite a lot of horror, and the first one I want to talk about is Come Closer by Sarah Gran. This is absolutely a book for fans of Rosemary's Baby. It's a short American horror novel set in no particular place, and it's about a woman who is possessed, but she certainly doesn't know it at first. The opening few pages are pretty hilarious. She's called into her boss's office because instead of putting down a report on his desk, she's put down some really offensive thing about him, which she swears she didn't write or print out, but it's there. And it's the first sign that she's being possessed. And then the signs come stronger from there. Her apartment is behaving strangely with these weird noises that only happen when she's in it. And her boyfriend hears them if she's there and he doesn't if she's not. She's losing track of time and she seems to be blacking out, and things get stranger from there. This is a possession story. It's, as I said, very Rosemary's Baby, and I really, really enjoyed it. It's the first thing I've read by Sarah Gran, and I was so blown away by it. It has this fantastic cult horror feel to it. And as I mentioned in another video, I love this cover, this blood red minimalism, the gorgeous font, the little illustration. This is stunning, and it really lured me in. I saw it in a bookshop and I went, yeah, I want this. I don't even know anything about the author or if this is good or not, and it really was. This is a weird story of possession, and I loved it. But what's interesting is from there, I then read this, The Book of the Most Precious Substance. This is another Sarah Gran book, and I kind of forgot it as soon as I read it. It didn't really stick in my head. The publisher were nice enough to send me this copy. I read it, and I thought it was all right. Rather than horror, this is a kind of thriller, and it's a book that is erotic in its events and its tone, but I wouldn't actually call it an erotic novel. You wouldn't read it for erotic purposes. It just has a lot of sex and kink in it, and a lot of that is delivered with a bit of discomfort, a bit of weirdness, and certainly a lack of sexiness. It tells the story of a woman who, very sadly, has a husband who is racked by early onset Alzheimer's. He is now non-communicative, and at one point she and her husband were both pretty successful authors, and she had to kind of give that dream up to look after him and find a more stable job. I don't know if her job is more stable. She's now a rare bookseller. She lives in upstate New York, and she travels into the city periodically to buy and sell rare books, and also to try and track them down. And she gets a whiff of a really strange occult book. Apparently there are only 5 of this book in existence, and she goes on a journey to find it because people are willing to pay millions for it, and that would really help her. But it's also supposed to have some kind of ritualistic sex magic in it that might actually work and might actually cure her husband's Alzheimer's. At least that's what she has in the back of her mind. She never voices this, but you know this is what's spurring her on. She hopes that the magic is real, but worst case scenario, she can sell it for a lot of money that would really make her and her husband more comfortable. She travels the world. She does some weird sex stuff. She learns more about the book, and you do as well in the process. And I thought it was pretty good, but not amazing. Certainly didn't leave the impact that Come Closer did. This is one of the best books I've read this year. I did a dedicated review that you can go watch and get more detail about this from there. This is Fingerbone by Hiroki Takahashi, a Japanese novel translated by the fantastic Takami Nieda, and it was published by Honford Star, who always publish incredible stuff. This is a World War II novel, and you don't read a lot of World War II novels from a Japanese perspective, so that was refreshing in and of itself. It's set in the jungle of Papua New Guinea, and we kind of split our time between a field hospital and the jungle itself. Our protagonist is a nameless Japanese soldier, and throughout the course of the novel, he meets and befriends other soldiers at the hospital and out on the front lines. And this is a story of loss. He befriends a lot of people, and they keep dying either of their wounds or of disease. Malaria is killing off a lot of people. And this is very much a frontline war novel, told from the perspective of a soldier, and it asks us to consider what all of this is really for. When it comes to the lives that are lost in war, you ask what they are dying for, what the sake of it all is. That's not grammar. And it really tore me up. It's a tiny little book that I read in an afternoon and it ripped me to pieces. Another Japanese novel that I read and reviewed this month is Mild Vertigo by Mieko Kanai, translated from the Japanese by Polly Barton, who's an amazing translator and author. As I said in my review, there's not much point in actually holding this up because Fitzcarraldo's gonna Fitzcarraldo. But this is a really, really good book. I didn't feel blown away by it, but a commenter in my review compared it to the works of Virginia Woolf, and absolutely, yes, I did not make that comparison myself, but as soon as they said it, I was like, yeah, this is very Virginia Woolf. It's also very Ducks Newburyport, if you've read that. It's the story of the life of a middle-class, comfortable, suburban Japanese woman in Tokyo. She's a housewife, she has 2 sons, and we just follow her life, but it's the way that it's written that is so enthralling. We're in her head sometimes, we're in conversation other times, we remark on the world around her, and we slip from one state to another, as we slip from her internal monologue to her opinions, to her conversations. We move very fluidly and almost in a surreal sense from bit to bit, and it makes you consider how life is really lived, the ways that our internal and external lives really do kind of cross over. Things get murky and confused. We know what's going on because we are ourselves, but when you see it from the outside, it's pretty remarkable in its unremarkableness. And I really, really enjoyed that. It's also a really dense and hefty book. Like, it's short, you can read it in a day, but you might not because it takes so much focus and attention. Watch my review if you want to know more. It's obviously been a month since my last wrap-up. That's how months work. But in my last wrap-up, I was consistently battling with renovations going on in another flat in this building, and it's happening again, a month later. So if you hear hammering in the walls, just ignore it, I'm trying to. This is You've Lost a Lot of Blood by my favourite horror author, Eric LaRocca. I did a video recently talking about why I love his stories so much, and I talked a lot about this there, so you can go check it out, but wow, I really enjoyed this book. I actually picked it up while I was on vacation in Amsterdam because it's really hard to get this in the UK. And in the Netherlands, you can pick up a lot of imported American publications, and so I grabbed this. This is a story within a story. Our narrator slash framing device is a man who has killed multiple people. We read his poetry, we read his diary, we learn about his relationships, but we also read a novella that he has written, and that novella takes up like 80% of the book. So you're getting a book inside of a book. The novella itself is very, very enticing. It's a really strange mystery about a young woman who's been hired to work on a video game for this really enigmatic, cult famous video games developer guy. She takes her little brother and the two of them drive to his weird, secluded house to work on this video game, but strange stuff starts happening in a very gothic horror way. But as I said, this novella is being written by the real protagonist of the story, who is a guy who kills people, and we learn more about his life and we read his bad poetry and we read chapter after chapter of this completed novella. It's very, very unusual, very, very enthralling, and I loved every page, honestly. I also read and reviewed Eric LaRocca's debut novel, Everything the Darkness Eats, and I don't know where I put my copy. Everything the Darkness Eats is awesome. Eric has written loads and loads of novellas and short stories, but this is his first proper-sized novel. It begins in Wales with a guy at a dig site. He's hired a bunch of men to find some weird ancient thing. They find it, and he then uses some kind of weird magic to blow up all of their heads and keep whatever it is for himself. We then move to the modern day in a small town in New England where this guy is living. People in this town are going missing one by one, mostly elderly people who are less likely to be noticed and missed. And it's clear that he's the one who is kidnapping them, maybe killing them, maybe not, and we don't know why. We follow two different protagonists, one a really, really lonely guy who is a fairly recent widower, and the other a guy who is in a gay relationship and he and his husband are suffering some really horrible homophobic abuse. Somehow their stories will converge, and they have something to do with this weird, maybe magic old man who blew up some heads in Wales decades ago and is now kidnapping people. And we need to know why and how all of these things are linked together. It's a very, very enticing novel that spills its secrets very slowly, bit by bit. And it culminates in something absolutely wild. Another incredible horror author that I absolutely love is T. Kingfisher, and I did another video talking about why I love her books so much, and this month I read A House with Good Bones, which is a really, really great gothic horror novel. It's a kind of multi-generational horror. It's about a woman in her early 30s who is a scientist. She's an entomologist. Yeah, the bug one. She's a bug scientist. She goes to stay with her mum for a while, but her mum is acting a little bit strangely, and our protagonist is trying to get to the bottom of why. The house that her mother lives in used to belong to her mother, who is now dead. But for some reason, our protagonist's mother is behaving as though she's being watched. And my first thought was, okay, so the grandmother's ghost is haunting the house, but there's more to it than that. Quite a lot more. And it goes to some really weird places. T. Kingfisher is very, very good at taking established tropes, themes, genres, and doing something new with them. Just sort of following an established route and then veering off it in really unexpected ways, and that is very true for A House with Good Bones. But T. Kingfisher, under her real name Ursula Vernon, has also written a bunch of good fantasy that I haven't actually read, but I've heard it's really good. And as T. Kingfisher, she's written Nettle and Bone, which is a very, very dark and twisted fairy tale fantasy that I adored. Once again, it's a story that's taking all of the tropes of fantasy and fairy tale, really, really stereotypical things that you come to expect, and twists it all around, subverts it completely. Prince Charming is the villain. He is a monstrous, predatory, abusive patriarch. An evil witch and a fairy godmother who's not very good at what she does accompany our princess to try to kill this evil prince. It's a complete subversion. There's a dog made of bones, there's a charming himbo knight who is shamed and no longer actually works as a knight, and they create this party of misfits who go to kill a prince. I adored this book. I really, really did. T. Kingfisher is amazing. I love everything that she writes, and I think there's a new book of hers coming out in the next few months that I can't wait for. She's churning out great book after great book at the moment. For Thy Great Pain, Have Mercy on My Little Pain is an amazing historical novel by Victoria Mackenzie. This is a book based on two real women who actually existed several hundred years ago in England. One of them is Julian of Norwich. You might know that name. A few of my commenters did, and after I read this, I researched her, and yeah, she was pretty famous. And the other is a woman who lived and existed at the exact same time, but was a little bit younger by a few decades, called Marjorie. And this is their stories tangled together. They are two women who have both seen visions of God, and they react differently to that. Julian becomes an anchoress, which is a role I'd never heard of within the church, where you hide yourself away in a prison cell attached to a physical church, and people can come and basically chat with you like a form of confessional or therapy, and you give them advice. And she spends her entire life in this cell after going through so much. She has an entire life before she goes into this cell, but it's what she chooses to do because she's seeing visions of God, and she doesn't want people to know that. Marjorie, however, gets these visions and talks about it a lot. She goes out into the town square to talk about it. She tells her family and her neighbors about it, and she's at risk of blasphemy and therefore maybe being burned or hanged or whatever they did at that time. And eventually the blurb tells us that she will go on a little pilgrimage to Norwich to meet Julian and talk with her, and their paths will converge. This is a tiny, beautiful little story, an incredible piece of historical fiction that taught me so much about these amazing medieval women who wrote amazing books and were completely forgotten about by history. The last video that I made before this one was on this really, really good book, Mrs. S by Kay Patrick. It's a debut novel by a non-binary Scottish writer, or at least a writer based in Scotland. And it tells the story of an Australian woman who's come to the UK and has ended up taking a job at a strange boarding school for girls. While there, she is wrestling with her sexual orientation and her gender identity. Actually, scratch that. She's not really thinking about her orientation. She knows that she's a lesbian, but she wonders if that is technically true when she is questioning her gender identity. She's increasingly more and more comfortable with butchness and masculinity, and even when she is mistaken to be a man. But the crux of the book is her obsession with the titular Mrs. S, the wife of the headmaster at this school where she's now working. She is absolutely obsessed with this woman. She thinks she's beautiful, she fantasizes over her, she wants to know more about Mrs. S, she wants to become closer to her, become friends with her, maybe even more. Despite the fact that Mrs. S is married to a man who is also our protagonist's boss, she can't stop fantasizing, she can't stop obsessing. This is a tale of obsession and personal growth, and I really, really loved it. Although it's written in a way that is not going to be for everyone, the writing style might turn people off, but I think it actually served the themes, the plot, the character writing, the tone, the emotions of the book. My Best Friend's Exorcism by Grady Hendrix. I read this while I was on vacation in Amsterdam, and just like every Grady Hendrix book, I loved it. He's always great. This is a nostalgia-style book set in the 80s about two girls who grow up together. They've been friends for a few years. They have two other friends that make their little group of four. And one day they take some illicit substances. One of them gets lost somewhere. And when she's found by her friends, she's different. She starts acting strangely over the coming weeks and months. And it becomes clear that she's definitely possessed. And that's not a spoiler, the book is called My Best Friend's Exorcism. Grady Hendrix is so good at writing assured female characters and female friendships, which is something that constantly surprises me. All of his protagonists are women, and they are all so well written. He really, really is so good at that. For a male horror writer, he's so good at writing genuinely great women characters who are flawed, who are sometimes very, very likable and very unlikable. It feels like he's correcting a lot of the misogynistic mistakes of Stephen King all by himself, and I really applaud him for that. This is just another great Grady Hendrix book. I love everything that he writes. He's never let me down. I haven't quite read everything he's written, but I'm getting there. Page Boy by Elliot Page. Now, I got to go to an event last week at the South Bank Centre where he was interviewed by Sean Fay, a legendary transgender journalist who wrote the transgender issue. She's awesome. Their conversation was great. I learned so much from it, and I talked a lot about that conversation when I reviewed this a few days ago. Page Boy, thankfully, is a really, really well-written book. I was a little bit nervous. Sean Fay mentioned this at the event, the idea that a celebrity churns out a memoir at some point, it's just something we expect, and they're so often badly written, but this is not. Elliot Page is a voracious bookworm. He reads so much good stuff, and it has really inspired his style of writing and his approach to creating non-fiction. He's really good at it. This is a book that's partially about his transition, but mostly about his relationships, his friendships, and the toxicity and twistedness of Hollywood. We go through his different roles that he's done, his career, his childhood, his relationship to his parents, but there is a very, very heavy emphasis on romantic relationships. And it's also beautifully written, and it's written out of order. As Sean Fay said, it's kind of like a short story collection, and we are not going from beginning to end. There is no chronology here. This book jumps around as Page sees fit. And that's a bold move to make, but it thematically works. Every chapter is kind of like a short story with a theme and a tone that he's trying to get at. And right from Elliot Page 1 to Elliot Page 260, this is a really, really good book. The Shadow Cabinet is a book that I read. Towards the end of last year, I talked about how much I loved Her Majesty's Royal Coven. That was a really, really great book. Juno Dawson is awesome. This is a very unique approach to urban fantasy. It's a book with an emphasis on being trans in a world of witches and warlocks, and that's really, really cool. And so, of course, the day that the second book came out, I picked it up in hardback. And it's alright. I can't remember what happened in it, and I feel kind of bad about that. HMRC was awesome. Like, I loved everything about it. I thought it was going to be kind of edgy teen YA fantasy, and it wasn't. I mean, it had elements of that, I guess, but not really. It was cringe in places, but the characters, the story, the transness of it, all beautiful, all really, really well done, and really, really funny in places. The Shadow Cabinet continues the story, literally, without any kind of a gap between. So you have to read the first one. But I don't remember it that well, and I can't talk about anything that happens in it without spoiling the first book entirely, like spoiling the very ending of the first book. But that's kind of lucky because I really can't remember this now. It was alright. I remember enjoying it well enough, but if I end up getting the third book next year, I'd have to reread this, and I don't think I will. Oh well. And then there's Babel. Last month I read R.F. Kuang's Yellowface, which is an amazing thriller, one of the best books I've read this year. I was utterly amazed by it, and so I finally picked up Babel, a book that some people love and some people hate, and I think is a genuine masterpiece. In fact, my video on this book is called Babel's a Masterpiece, and here's why. And I nicked that from H-Bomber Guy. I mean, it works for him. I'm sure I'll get 1 million subs real soon. Babel's an amazing blend of historical fiction, urban fantasy, and dark academia, and it handles all of that so deftly. It's also a very, very angry book. Do you know what? I'm not going to talk about it. Go watch my review. Go read Babel. I love this book so much. I really, really did. There you go. There's everything I read. It's now on the floor everywhere. I have to pick those up now. I also read a manga. I always forget to talk about the manga that I read because I always read it digitally and it's not physically here. I read the first volume of Land of the Lustrous, and that was a really, really good manga. A really strange fantasy manga. I enjoyed it. Beautifully, beautifully drawn. So go read Land of the Lustrous if you like manga. It's real good. I've heard there's an anime. Haven't watched it. Don't really watch anime anymore, but I still love manga. So Land of the Lustrous. Good stuff. Anyway, this is all the stuff I read. I'm looking at it on the floor. You can't see that, but it's quite a mess. I'm going to go now. Support me on Patreon if you'd like to. Subscribe to my newsletter, which is a thing I always forget to tell people I have. Go click all the links in the description and check out all of my socials and my newsletter and my Patreon. If you want to support me on Patreon, I would really, really, really appreciate your help. And my patrons are awesome. Awesome people. So go be one of them. Check out some of these books and subscribe for books.